Whether the labour devoted to obtaining the money corresponded to the pleasure given by what was bought with it was a consideration he had long ago dismissed. His business calculation that there was a certain price below which he could not sell certain grain was forgotten too. The rye, for the price of which he had so long held out, had been sold for 50 kopecks a measure cheaper than it had been fetching a month ago. Even the consideration that with such an expenditure he could not go on living for a year without debt, that even had no force. Only one thing was essential: to have money in the bank without inquiring where it came from, so as to know that one had the wherewithal to buy meat for tomorrow. And this condition had hitherto been fulfilled. He had always had the money in the bank. But now the money in the bank had gone, and he could not quite tell where to get the next instalment. And this it was which, at the moment when Kitty had mentioned money, had disturbed him, but he had no time to think about it. He drove off, thinking of Katavarsof and the meeting with Metrov that was before him. Chapter 3. Levin had on this visit to town seen a great deal of his old friend at the university, Professor Katavarsof, whom he had not seen since his marriage. He liked in Katavarsof the clearness and simplicity of his conception of life. Levin thought that the clearness of Katavarsov's conception of life was due to the poverty of his nature. Katavarsov thought the disconnectedness of Levin's ideas was due to his lack of intellectual discipline, but Levin enjoyed Katavarsov's clearness, and Katavarsov enjoyed the abundance of Levin's untrained ideas, and they liked to meet and to discuss. Levin had read Katavarsov some parts of his book, and he had liked them. On the previous day, Katavarsov had met Levin at a public lecture and told him that the celebrated Metrov, whose article Levin had so much liked, was in Moscow, that he had been much interested by what Katavarsov had told him about Levin's work, and that he was coming to see him tomorrow at 11, and would be very glad to make Levin's acquaintance. "You're positively a reformed character, I'm glad to see," said Katavarsov, meeting Levin in the little drawing-room. "I heard the bell and thought, impossible, that it can be he at the exact time. Well, what do you say to the Montenegrins now? They're a race of warriors." "Why, what's happened?" asked Levin. Katavarsov, in a few words, told him the last piece of news from the war, and going into his study introduced Levin to a short, thick-set man of pleasant appearance. This was Metrov. The conversation touched for a brief space on politics and how recent events were looked at in the higher spheres in Petersburg. Metrov repeated a saying that had reached him through a most trustworthy source, reported as having been uttered on this subject by the Tsar and one of the ministers. Katavarsov had heard also on excellent authority that the Tsar had said something quite different. Levin tried to imagine circumstances in which both sayings might have been uttered, and the conversation on that topic dropped. "Yes, here he's written almost a book on the natural conditions of the labourer in relation to the land," said Katavarsov. "I'm not a specialist, but I, as a natural science man, was pleased that he's not taking mankind as something outside biological laws, but on the contrary, seeing his dependence on his surroundings, and in that dependence seeking the laws of his development." "That's very interesting," said Metrov. "What I began precisely was to write a book on agriculture, but studying the chief instrument of agriculture, the labourer," said Levin, reddening, "I could not help coming to quite unexpected results." And Levin began carefully, as it were, feeling his ground, to expound his views. He knew Metrov had written an article against the generally accepted theory of political economy, but to what extent he could reckon on his sympathy with his own new views he did not know and could not guess from the clever and serene face of the learned man. "But in what do you see the special characteristics of the Russian labourer?" said Metrov. In his biological characteristics, so to speak, or in the condition in which he is placed? Levin saw that there was an idea underlying this question with which he did not agree. But he went on explaining his own idea that the Russian laborer has a quite special view of the land, different from that of other people, and to support this proposition he made haste to add that in his opinion this attitude of the Russian peasant was due to the consciousness of his vocation to people vast unoccupied expanses in the East. One may easily be led into error in basing any conclusion on the general vocation of a people, said Metrov, interrupting Levin. The condition of the laborer will always depend on his relation to the land and to capital. And without letting Levin finish explaining his idea, Metrov began expounding to him the special point of his own theory. In what the point of his theory lay, Levin did not understand, because he did not take the trouble to understand. He saw that Metrov, like other people, in spite of his own article, in which he had attacked the current theory of political economy, looked at the position of the Russian peasant simply from the point of view of capital, wages, and rent. He would indeed have been obliged to admit that in the eastern, much the larger, part of Russia, rent was as yet nil, that for 9/10 of the 80 millions of the Russian peasants' wages took the form simply of food provided for themselves, and that capital does not so far exist except in the form of the most primitive tools. Yet it was only from that point of view that he considered every labourer, though in many points he differed from the economists and had his own theory of the wage fund, which he expounded to Levin. Levin listened reluctantly, and at first made objections. He would have liked to interrupt Metrov to explain his own thought, which in his opinion would have rendered further exposition of Metrov's theories superfluous. But later on, feeling convinced that they looked at the matter so differently that they could never understand one another, he did not even oppose his statements, but simply listened. Although what Metrov was saying was by now utterly devoid of interest for him, he yet experienced a certain satisfaction in listening to him. It flattered his vanity that such a learned man should explain his ideas to him so eagerly, with such intensity and confidence in Levin's understanding of the subject, sometimes with a mere hint referring him to the whole aspect of the subject. He put this down to his own credit, unaware that Metrov, who had already discussed his theory over and over again with all his intimate friends, talked of it with special eagerness to every new person, and in general was eager to talk to anyone of any subject that interested him, even if still obscure to himself. "We are late, though," said Katavasov, looking at his watch directly Metrov had finished his discourse. "Yes. There's a meeting of the Society of Amateurs today in commemoration of the Jubilee of Svintich," said Katavasov in answer to Levin's inquiry. "Pyotr Ivanovitch and I were going. I've promised to deliver an address on his labours in zoology. Come along with us. It's very interesting." "Yes, and indeed it's time to start," said Metrov. "Come with us, and from there, if you care to, come to my place. I should very much like to hear your work." "Oh, no, it's no good yet, it's unfinished, but I shall be very glad to go to the meeting." "I say, friends, have you heard? He has handed in the separate report," Katavasov called from the other room where he was pulling on his frock coat. And a conversation sprang up upon the university question, which was a very important event that winter in Moscow. 3 old professors in the council had not accepted the opinion of the younger professors. The young ones had registered a separate resolution. This, in the judgment of some people, was monstrous. In the judgment of others, it was the simplest and most just thing to do, and the professors were split up into 2 parties. One party, to which Katavasov belonged, saw in the opposite party a scoundrelly betrayal and treachery, while the opposite party saw in them childishness and lack of respect for the authorities. Levin, though he did not belong to the university, had several times already during his stay in Moscow heard and talked about this matter, and had his own opinion on the subject. he took part in the conversation that was continued in the street as they all three walked to the buildings of the old university. The meeting had already begun. Round the cloth-covered table at which Katavasov and Metrov seated themselves there were some half-dozen persons, and one of these was bending close over a manuscript, reading something aloud. Levin sat down in one of the empty chairs that was standing round the table, and in a whisper asked a student sitting near what was being read. The student, eyeing Levin with displeasure, said, "Biography." Though Levin was not interested in the biography, he could not help listening and learn some new and interesting facts about the life of the distinguished man of science. When the reader had finished, the chairman thanked him and read some verses of the poet Ment, sent him on the Jubilee, and said a few words by way of thanks to the poet. Then Katavasov, in his loud, ringing voice, read his address on the scientific labours of the man whose Jubilee was being kept. When Katavasov had finished, Levin looked at his watch, saw it was past 1, and thought that there would not be time before the concert to read Metrov his book, and indeed he did not now care to do so. During the reading he had thought over their conversation. He saw distinctly that though Metrov's ideas might perhaps have value, his own ideas had a value too, and their ideas could only be made clear and lead to something if each worked separately in his chosen path, and that nothing would be gained by putting their ideas together. And having made up his mind to refuse Metrov's invitation, Levin went up to him at the end of the meeting. Metrov introduced Levin to the chairman, with whom he was talking of the political news. Metrov told the chairman what he had already told Levin, and Levin made the same remarks on his news that he had already made that morning, but for the sake of variety he expressed also a new opinion which had only just struck him. After that the conversation turned again on the university question. As Levin had already heard it all, he made haste to tell Metrov that he was sorry he could not take advantage of his invitation, took leave, and drove to Lvov's. Chapter 4. Lvov, the husband of Natalia, Kitty's sister, had spent all his life in foreign capitals where he had been educated and had been in the diplomatic service. During the previous year he had left the diplomatic service, not owing to any unpleasantness — he never had any unpleasantness with anyone — and was transferred to the department of the court of the palace in Moscow in order to give his two boys the best education possible. In spite of the striking contrast in their habits and views, and the fact that Lvov was older than Levin, they had seen a great deal of one another that winter, and had taken a great liking to each other. Lvov was at home, and Levin went in to him unannounced. Lvov, in a house-coat with a belt and in chamois leather shoes, was sitting in an arm-chair, and with a pince-nez with blue glasses he was reading a book that stood on a reading desk, while in his beautiful hand he held a half-burned cigarette daintily away from him. His handsome, delicate, and still youthful-looking face, to which his curly, glistening, silvery hair gave a still more aristocratic air, lighted up with a smile when he saw Levin. "Capital! I was meaning to send to you. How's Kitty? Sit here, it's more comfortable." He got up and pushed up a rocking-chair. "Have you read the last circular in the Journal de St. Petersburg? I think it's excellent," he said with a slight French accent. Levin told him what he had heard from Katavasov was being said in Petersburg, and after talking a little about politics he told him of his interview with Metrov and the Learned Society's meeting. To Lvov it was very interesting. "That's what I envy you, that you are able to mix with these interesting scientific circles," he said. And as he talked, he passed as usual into French, which was easier to him. "It's true I haven't time for it. My official work and the children leave me no time, and then I'm not ashamed to own that my education has been too defective." "That I don't believe," said Levin with a smile, feeling as he always did, touched at Lvov's low opinion of himself, which was not in the least put on from a desire to seem or to be modest, but was absolutely sincere. "Oh, yes, indeed. I feel now how badly educated I am. To educate my children I positively have to look up a great deal, and in fact simply to study myself. For it's not enough to have teachers, there must be someone to look after them, just as on your land you want labourers and an overseer. See what I'm reading." He pointed to Bushlev's grammar on the desk. "It's expected of Misha, and it's so difficult. Come, explain to me. Here he says—" Levin tried to explain to him that it couldn't be understood, but that it had to be taught, but Lvov would not agree with him. "Oh, you're laughing at it. On the contrary, you can't imagine how, when I look at you, I'm always learning the task that lies before me, that is, the education of one's children." "Well, there's nothing for you to learn," said Lvov. "All I know," said Levin, "is that I have never seen better brought up children than yours, and I wouldn't wish for children better than yours." Lvov visibly tried to restrain the expression of his delight, but he was positively radiant with smiles. "If only they're better than I! That's all I desire. You don't know yet all the work," he said, "with boys who've been left like mine to run wild abroad. You'll catch all that up. They're such clever children. The great thing is the education of character. That's what I learn when I look at your children." "You talk of the education of character. You can't imagine how difficult that is. You have hardly succeeded in combating one tendency when others crop up and the struggle begins again. If one had not a support in religion, you remember we talked about that? No father could bring up children relying on his own strength alone without that help." This subject, which always interested Levin, was cut short by the entrance of the beauty Natalia Alexandrovna, dressed to go out. "I didn't know you were here," she said, unmistakably feeling no regret, but a positive pleasure in interrupting this conversation on a topic she had heard so much of that she was by now weary of it. "Well, how is Kitty? I'm dining with you today. I tell you what, Arseny," she turned to her husband, "you take the carriage." And the husband and wife began to discuss their arrangements for the day. As the husband had to drive to meet someone on official business, while the wife had to go to the concert and some public meeting of a committee on the Eastern question, there was a great deal to consider and settle. Levin had to take part in their plans as one of themselves. It was settled that Levin should go with Natalia to the concert and the meeting, and that from there they should send the carriage to the office for Arseny, and that he should call for her and take her to Kitty's, or that, if he had not finished his work, he should send the carriage back and Levin would go with her. "He's spoiling me," Lvov said to his wife. "He assures me that our children are splendid, when I know how much that's bad there is in them." "Arseny goes to extremes, I always say," said his wife. "If you look for perfection you will never be satisfied. And it's true, as Papa says, that when we were brought up there was one extreme. We were kept in the basement, while our parents lived in the best rooms. Now it's just the other way. The parents are in the wash-house, while the children are in the best rooms. Parents now are not expected to live at all, but to exist altogether for their children." "Well, what if they like it better?" Lvov said, with his beautiful smile, touching her hand. "Anyone who didn't know you would think you were a stepmother, not a true mother." "No, extremes are not good in anything," Natalia said serenely, putting his paper knife straight in its proper place on the table. "Well, come here, you perfect children," Lvov said to the two handsome boys who came in, and after bowing to Levin went up to their father, obviously wishing to ask him about something. Levin would have liked to talk to them, to hear what they would say to their father, but Natalia began talking to him, and then Lvov's colleague in the service, Mahotin, walked in, wearing his court uniform, to go with him to meet someone, and a conversation was kept up without a break upon Herzegovina, Princess Kozinskaya, the town council, and the sudden death of Madame Apraxina. Levin even forgot the commission entrusted to him. He recollected it as he was going into the hall. "Oh, Kitty told me to talk to you about Oblonsky," he said as Lvov was standing on the stairs, seeing his wife and Levin off. Yes, Maman wants us, les beaux-frères, to attack him," he said, blushing. "But why should I?" "Well, then I will attack him," said Madame Lvova with a smile, standing in her white sheepskin cape, waiting till they had finished speaking. "Come, let us go." Chapter 5. At the concert in the afternoon, two very interesting things were performed. One was a fantasia, King Lear. The other was a quartet dedicated to the memory of Bach. Both were new, and in the new style, and Levin was eager to form an opinion of them. After escorting his sister-in-law to her stall, he stood against a column and tried to listen as attentively and conscientiously as possible. He tried not to let his attention be distracted, and not to spoil his impression by looking at the conductor in a white tie, waving his arms, which always disturbed his enjoyment of music so much, or the ladies in bonnets, with strings carefully tied over their ears, and all these people either thinking of nothing at all or thinking of all sorts of things except the music. He tried to avoid meeting musical connoisseurs or talkative acquaintances, and stood looking at the floor straight before him, listening. But the more he listened to the fantasia of King Lear, the further he felt from forming any definite opinion of it. There was, as it were, a continual beginning, a preparation of the musical expression of some feeling, but it fell to pieces again directly, breaking into new musical motives, or simply nothing but the whims of the composer, exceedingly complex but disconnected sounds. And these fragmentary musical expressions, though sometimes beautiful, were disagreeable because they were utterly unexpected and not led up to by anything. Gaiety and grief and despair and tenderness and triumph followed one another without any connection, like the emotions of a madman. And those emotions, like a madman's, sprung up quite unexpectedly. During the whole of the performance, Levin felt like a deaf man watching people dancing, and was in a state of complete bewilderment when the fantasia was over, and felt a great weariness from the fruitless strain on his attention. Loud applause resounded on all sides. Everyone got up, moved about, and began talking. Anxious to throw some light on his own perplexity from the impressions of others, Levin began to walk about, looking for connoisseurs, and was glad to see a well-known musical amateur in conversation with Pestsov, whom he knew. "Marvellous," Pestsov was saying in his mellow bass. "How are you, Konstantin Dmitrievitch? Particularly sculpturesque and plastic, so to say, and richly coloured is that passage where you feel Cordelia's approach, where woman, das ewig Weibliche, enters into conflict with fate, isn't it?" "You mean, what has Cordelia to do with it?" Levin asked timidly, forgetting that the fantasia was supposed to represent King Lear. "Cordelia comes in. See, here," said Pestsov, tapping his finger on the satiny surface of the programme he held in his hand and passing it to Levin. Only then Levin recollected the title of the fantasia and made haste to read in the Russian translation the lines from Shakespeare that were printed on the back of the programme. "You can't follow it without that," said Pestsov, addressing Levin, as the person he had been speaking to had gone away, and he had no one to talk to. In the entr'acte, Levin and Pestsov fell into an argument upon the merits and defects of music of the Wagner school. Levin maintained that the mistake of Wagner and all his followers lay in their trying to take music into the sphere of another art, just as poetry goes wrong when it tries to paint a face as the art of painting ought to do, and as an instance of this mistake he cited the sculptor who carved in marble certain poetic phantoms flitting round the figure of the poet on the pedestal. "These phantoms were so far from being phantoms that they were positively clinging on the ladder," said Levin. The comparison pleased him, but he could not remember whether he had not used the same phrase before, and to Pestsov too, and as he said it he felt confused. Pestsov maintained that art is one, and that it can attain its highest manifestations only by conjunction with all kinds of art. The second piece that was performed Levin could not hear. Pestsov, who was standing beside him, was talking to him almost all the time, condemning the music for its excessive affected assumption of simplicity and comparing it with the simplicity of the pre-Raphaelites in painting. As he went out, Levin met many more acquaintances, with whom he talked of politics, of music, and of common acquaintances. Among others, he met Count Boll, whom he had utterly forgotten to call upon. "Well, go at once, then," Madame Lvova said when he told her. "Perhaps they'll not be at home, and then you can come to the meeting to fetch me. You'll find me still there." Chapter 6. "Perhaps they're not at home," said Levin, as he went into the hall of Countess Bola's house. "At home. Please walk in," said the porter, resolutely removing his overcoat. "How annoying," thought Levin, with a sigh, taking off one glove and stroking his hat. "What did I come for? What have I to say to them?" As he passed through the first drawing-room, Levin met in the doorway Countess Bola, giving some order to a servant with a careworn and severe face. On seeing Levin, she smiled and asked him to come into the little drawing-room, where he heard voices. In this room there were sitting in armchairs the two daughters of the Countess and a Moscow colonel whom Levin knew. Levin went up, greeted them, and sat down beside the sofa with his hat on his knees. "How is your wife? Have you been at the concert? We couldn't go. Mamma had to be at the funeral service." "Yes, I heard. What a sudden death," said Levin. The Countess came in, sat down on the sofa, and she, too, asked after his wife and inquired about the concert. Levin answered, and repeated an inquiry about Madame Apraxina's sudden death. "But she was always in weak health." "Were you at the opera yesterday?" "Yes, I was." "Luca was very good." "Yes, very good," he said. And as it was utterly of no consequence to him what they thought of him, he began repeating what they had heard 100 times about the characteristics of the singer's talent. Countess Bola pretended to be listening. Then, when he had said enough and paused, the colonel, who had been silent till then, began to talk. The colonel, too, talked of the opera and about culture. At last, after speaking of the proposed Folle Journée at Turin's, the colonel laughed, got up noisily, and went away. Levin, too, rose, but he saw by the face of the Countess that it was not yet time for him to go. He must stay 2 minutes longer. He sat down. But as he was thinking all the while how stupid it was, he could not find a subject for conversation, and sat silent. "You are not going to the public meeting? They say it will be very interesting," began the Countess. "No, I promised my belle-sœur to fetch her from it," said Levin. A silence followed. The mother once more exchanged glances with the daughter. "Well, now I think the time has come," thought Levin, and he got up. The ladies shook hands with him and begged him to say mille choses to his wife for them. The porter asked him, as he gave him his coat, "Where is your honour staying?" and immediately wrote down his address in a big, handsomely bound book. "Of course I don't care, but still I feel ashamed and awfully stupid," thought Levin, consoling himself with the reflection that everyone does it. He drove to the public meeting, where he was to find his sister-in-law, so as to drive home with her. At the public meeting of the committee there were a great many people, and almost all the highest society. Levin was in time for the report, which, as everyone said, was very interesting. When the reading of the report was over, people moved about, and Levin met Sviazhsky, who invited him very pressingly to come that evening to a meeting of the Society of Agriculture, where a celebrated lecture was to be delivered, and Stefan Arkadyevitch, who had only just come from the races, and many other acquaintances. And Levin heard and uttered various criticisms on the meeting, on the new fantasia, and on a public trial. But probably from the mental fatigue he was beginning to feel, he made a blunder in speaking of the trial, and this blunder he recalled several times with vexation. Speaking of the sentence upon a foreigner who had been condemned in Russia, and of how unfair it would be to punish him by exile abroad, Levin repeated what he had heard the day before in conversation from an acquaintance. "I think sending him abroad is much the same as punishing a carp by putting it into the water," said Levin. Then he recollected that this idea, which he had heard from an acquaintance and uttered as his own, came from a fable of Krylov's, and that the acquaintance had picked it up from a newspaper article. After driving home with his sister-in-law and finding Kitty in good spirits and quite well, Levin drove to the club. Chapter 7. Levin reached the club just at the right time. Members and visitors were driving up as he arrived. Levin had not been at the club for a very long while, not since he lived in Moscow, when he was leaving the university and going into society. He remembered the club, the external details of its arrangement, but he had completely forgotten the impression it made on him in old days. But as soon as, driving into the wide semicircular court and getting out of the sledge, he mounted the steps, and the hall porter, adorned with a crossways scarf, noiselessly opened the door to him with a bow, and as soon as he saw in the porter's room the cloaks and goloshes of members who thought it less trouble to take them off downstairs, and as soon as he heard the mysterious ringing bell that preceded him as he ascended the easy carpeted staircase, and saw the statue on the landing, and the third porter at the top doors, a familiar figure, grown older, in the club livery, opening the door without haste or delay, and scanning the visitors as they passed in, Levin felt the old impression of the club come back in a rush, an impression of repose, comfort, and propriety. "Your hat, please," the porter said to Levin, who forgot the club rule to leave his hat in the porter's room. "Long time since you've been. The prince put your name down yesterday. Prince Stefan Arkadyevitch is not here yet." The porter did not only know Levin, but also all his ties and relationships, and so immediately mentioned his intimate friends. Passing through the outer hall, divided up by screens, and the room partitioned on the right, where a man sits at the fruit buffet, Levin overtook an old man walking slowly in, and entered the dining room full of noise and people. He walked along the tables, almost all full, and looked at the visitors. He saw people of all sorts, old and young. Some he knew a little, some intimate friends. There was not a single cross or worried-looking face. All seemed to have left their cares and anxieties in the porter's room with their hats, and were all deliberately getting ready to enjoy the material blessings of life. Sviazhsky was here, and Shuchabatsky, Nevyedovsky, and the old prince, and Vronsky, and Sergei Ivanovitch. "Ah, why are you late?" the prince said, smiling, and giving him his hand over his own shoulder. "How's Kitty?" he added, smoothing out the napkin he had tucked in at his waistcoat buttons. "All right. They are dining at home, all three of them." "Ah, Arlene, Nadine, to be sure. There's no room with us. Go to that table and make haste and take a seat," said the prince, and turning away he carefully took a plate of eel soup. "Levin, this way!" a good-natured voice shouted a little farther on. It was Turovtsin. He was sitting with a young officer, and beside them were 2 chairs turned upside down. Levin gladly went up to them. He had always liked the good-hearted rake Turovtsin. He was associated in his mind with memories of his courtship, and at that moment, after the strain of intellectual conversation, the sight of Turovtsin's good-natured face was particularly welcome. "For you and Oblonsky. He'll be here directly." The young man, holding himself very erect, with eyes forever twinkling with enjoyment, was an officer from Petersburg, Gagin. Turovtsin introduced them. "Oblonsky's always late." "Ah, here he is." "Have you only just come?" said Oblonsky, coming quickly towards them. "Good day. Had some vodka? Well, come along then." Levin got up and went with him to the big table spread with spirits and appetizers of the most various kinds. One would have thought that out of the 24 delicacies one might find something to one's taste, but Stepan Arkadyevitch asked for something special, and one of the liveried waiters standing by immediately brought what was required. They drank a wine-glassful and returned to their table. At once, while they were still at the soup, Gagin was served with champagne and told the waiter to fill 4 glasses. Levin did not refuse the wine and asked for a second bottle. He was very hungry and ate and drank with great enjoyment, and with still greater enjoyment took part in the lively and simple conversation of his companions. Gagin, dropping his voice, told the last good story from Petersburg, and the story, though improper and stupid, was so ludicrous that Levin broke into roars of laughter, so loud that those near looked round. "That's in the same style as 'That's a thing I can't endure.' You know the story," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Ah, that's exquisite. Another bottle," he said to the waiter, and he began to relate his good story. "Pyotr Ilyich Vinovsky invites you to drink with him," a little old waiter interrupted Stepan Arkadyevitch, bringing 2 delicate glasses of sparkling champagne and addressing Stepan Arkadyevitch and Levin. Stepan Arkadyevitch took the glass, and looking towards a bald man with red moustaches at the other end of the table, he nodded to him, smiling. "Who's that?" asked Levin. "You met him once at my place, don't you remember? A good-natured fellow." Levin did the same as Stepan Arkadyevitch and took the glass. Stepan Arkadyevitch's anecdote, too, was very amusing. Levin told his story, and that, too, was successful. Then they talked of horses, of the races, of what they had been doing that day, and of how smartly Vronsky's Atlas had won the first prize. Levin did not notice how the time passed at dinner. "Ah, and here they are," Stepan Arkadyevitch said towards the end of dinner, leaning over the back of his chair and holding out his hand to Vronsky, who came up with a tall officer of the guards. Vronsky's face, too, beamed with the look of good-humoured enjoyment that was general in the club. He propped his elbow playfully on Stepan Arkadyevitch's shoulder, whispering something to him, and he held out his hand to Levin with the same good-humoured smile. "Very glad to meet you," he said. "I looked out for you at the election, but I was told you'd gone away." "Yes, I left the same day. We've just been talking of your horse. I congratulate you," said Levin. "It was very rapidly run." "Yes. You've raced horses too, haven't you?" "No, my father had, but I remember and know something about it." "Where have you dined?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch. "We were at the second table, behind the columns." "We've been celebrating his success," said the tall colonel. "It's his 2nd imperial prize. I wish I might have the luck at cards he has with horses. Well, why waste the precious time? I'm going to the infernal regions," added the colonel, and he walked away. "That's Yashvin," Vronsky said in answer to Turovtsin, and he sat down in the vacated seat beside them. He drank the glass offered him and ordered a bottle of wine. Under the influence of the club atmosphere, or the wine he had drunk, Levin chatted away to Vronsky of the best breeds of cattle, and was very glad not to feel the slightest hostility to this man. He even told him, among other things, that he had heard from his wife that she had met him at Princess Maria Borisovna's. "Ah, Princess Maria Borisovna, she's exquisite," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, and he told an anecdote about her which set them all laughing. Vronsky particularly laughed with such simple-hearted amusement that Levin felt quite reconciled to him. "Well, have we finished?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, getting up with a smile. "Let us go." Chapter 8. Getting up from the table, Levin walked with Gagin through the lofty room to the billiard-room, feeling his arms swing as he walked with a peculiar lightness and ease. As he crossed the big room, he came upon his father-in-law. "Well, how do you like our temple of indolence?" said the prince, taking his arm. "Come along, come along." "Yes, I wanted to walk about and look at everything. It's interesting." "Yes, it's interesting for you, but its interest for me is quite different. You look at those little old men now," he said, pointing to a club member with a bent back and projecting lip, shuffling towards them in his soft boots, "and imagine that they were shlupiks like that from their birth up." "How shlupiks?" "I see you don't know that name. That's our club designation. You know the game of rolling eggs. When one's rolled a long while it becomes a shlupik. So it is with us. One goes on coming and coming to the club and ends by becoming a shlupik. Ah, you laugh. But we look out, for fear of dropping into it ourselves." "You know Prince Tchetsky?" inquired the prince, and Levin saw by his face that he was just going to relate something funny. "No, I don't know him." "You don't say so. Well, Prince Tchetsky is a well-known figure. No matter, though. He's always playing billiards here. Only 3 years ago he was not a shlupik and kept up his spirits and even used to call other people shlupiks. But one day he turns up, and our porter, you know Vasily? Why, that fat one. He's famous for his bon mot. And so Prince Tchetsky asks him, 'Come, Vasily, who's here? Any shlupiks here yet?' And he says, 'You're the third.' Yes, my dear boy, that he did." Talking and greeting the friends they met, Levin and the prince walked through all the rooms. The great room, where tables had already been set and the usual partners were playing for small stakes. The divan room, where they were playing chess, and Sergei Ivanovitch was sitting talking to somebody. The billiard room, where about a sofa in a recess there was a lively party drinking champagne. Gagin was one of them. They peeped into the infernal regions, where a good many men were crowding round one table, at which Yashvin was sitting. Trying not to make a noise, they walked into the dark reading room, where under the shaded lamps there sat a young man with a wrathful countenance, turning over one journal after another, and a bald general buried in a book. They went, too, into what the prince called the intellectual room, where 3 gentlemen were engaged in a heated discussion of the latest political news. "Prince, please come, we're ready," said one of his card party, who had come to look for him, and the prince went off. "Prince, please come, we're ready," said one of his card party, who had come to look for him, and the prince went off. Levin sat down and listened, but recalling all the conversation of the morning, he felt all of a sudden fearfully bored. He got up hurriedly and went to look for Oblonsky and Turovtsin, with whom it had been so pleasant. Turovtsin was one of the circle drinking in the billiard-room, and Stepan Arkadyevitch was talking with Vronsky near the door at the farther corner of the room. "It's not that she's dull," It's this undefined, this unsettled position Levin caught, and he was hurrying away, but Stefan Arkadyevitch called to him. "Levin," said Stefan Arkadyevitch, and Levin noticed that his eyes were not full of tears exactly, but moist, which always happened when he had been drinking or when he was touched. Just now it was due to both causes. "Levin, don't go," he said, and he warmly squeezed his arm above the elbow, obviously not at all wishing to let him go. "This is a true friend of mine, almost my greatest friend," he said to Vronsky. "You have become even closer and dearer to me, and I want you, and I know you ought, to be friends, and great friends, because you are both splendid fellows." "Well, there's nothing for us now but to kiss and be friends," Vronsky said, with good-natured playfulness, holding out his hand. Levin quickly took the offered hand and pressed it warmly. "I'm very, very glad," said Levin. "Waiter, a bottle of champagne," said Stefan Arkadyevitch. "And I'm very glad," said Vronsky. But in spite of Stefan Arkadyevitch's desire, and their own desire, they had nothing to talk about, and both felt it. "Do you know, he has never met Anna," Stefan Arkadyevitch said to Vronsky, "and I want above everything to take him to see her. Let us go, Levin." "Really?" said Vronsky. "She'll be very glad to see you. I should be going home at once," he added, "but I'm worried about Yashvin, and I want to stay on till he finishes." "Why, is he losing?" "He keeps losing, and I'm the only friend that can restrain him." "Well, what do you say to pyramids? Levin, will you play?" "Capital," said Stefan Arkadyevitch. "Get the table ready," he said to the marker. "It has been ready for a long while," answered the marker, who had already set the balls in a triangle and was knocking the red one about for his own diversion. "Well, let us begin." After the game, Vronsky and Levin sat down at Gargin's table, and at Stefan Arkadyevitch's suggestion, Levin took a hand in the game. Vronsky sat down at the table, surrounded by friends who were incessantly coming up to him. Every now and then he went into the infernal to keep an eye on Yashvin. Levin was enjoying a delightful sense of repose after the mental fatigue of the morning. He was glad that all hostility was at an end with Vronsky, and the sense of peace, decorum, and comfort never left him. When the game was over, Stefan Arkadyevitch took Levin's arm. "Well, let us go to Anna's then, at once, eh? She is at home. I promised her long ago to bring you. Where were you meaning to spend the evening?" "Oh, nowhere specially. I promised Sviazhsky to go to the Society of Agriculture. By all means, let us go," said Levin. "Very good, come along. Find out if my carriage is here," Stefan Arkadyevitch said to the waiter. Levin went up to the table, paid the 40 rubles he had lost, paid his bill, the amount of which was in some mysterious way ascertained by the little old waiter who stood at the counter, and swinging his arms he walked through all the rooms to the way out. Chapter 9. "Oblonsky's carriage!" the porter shouted in an angry bass. The carriage drove up and both got in. It was only for the first few moments, while the carriage was driving out of the clubhouse gates, that Levin was still under the influence of the club atmosphere of repose, comfort, and unimpeachable good form. But as soon as the carriage drove out into the street, and he felt it jolting over the uneven road, heard the angry shout of a sledge-driver coming towards them, saw in the uncertain light the red blind of a tavern and the shops, this impression was dissipated, and he began to think over his actions and to wonder whether he was doing right in going to see Anna. What would Kitty say? But Stefan Arkadyevitch gave him no time for reflection, and, as though divining his doubts, he scattered them. "How glad I am," he said, "that you should know her. You know Dolly has long wished for it. And Lvov's been to see her and often goes. Though she is my sister," Stefan Arkadyevitch pursued, "I don't hesitate to say that she's a remarkable woman.
but you will see. Her position is very painful, especially now."
"Why especially now?"
"We are carrying on negotiations with her husband about a divorce, and he's agreed, but there are difficulties in regard to the son, and the business, which ought to have been arranged long ago, has been dragging on for 3 months past. As soon as the divorce is over, she will marry Vronsky. How stupid these old ceremonies are, that no one believes in, and which only prevent people being comfortable," Stepan Arkadyevitch put in. "Well, then their position will be as regular as mine, as yours."
"What is the difficulty?" said Levin.
"Oh, it's a long and tedious story. The whole business is in such an anomalous position with us. But the point is, she has been for 3 months in Moscow, where everyone knows her, waiting for the divorce. She goes out nowhere, sees no woman except Dolly, because, do you understand, she doesn't care to have people come as a favor. That fool Princess Varvara, even she has left her, considering this a breach of propriety. Well, you see, in such a position any other woman would not have found resources in herself. But you'll see how she has arranged her life, how calm, how dignified she is. To the left, in the crescent opposite the church," shouted Stepan Arkadyevitch, leaning out of the window. "Phew, how hot it is," he said, in spite of the 12 degrees of frost, flinging his open overcoat still wider open.
"But she has a daughter. No doubt she's busy looking after her," said Levin.
"I believe you picture every woman simply as a female, un converse," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "If she's occupied, it must be with her children. No, she brings her up capitally, I believe, but one doesn't hear about her. She's busy, in the first place, with what she writes. I see you're smiling ironically, but you're wrong. She's writing a children's book, and doesn't talk about it to anyone. She read it to me, and I gave the manuscript to Volkev. You know, the publisher? And he's an author himself, too, I fancy. He understands those things, and he says it's a remarkable piece of work. But are you fancying she's an authoress? Not a bit of it. She's a woman with heart before everything, but you'll see. Now she has a little English girl with her, and a whole family she's looking after."
"Oh. Something in a philanthropic way?"
"Why, you will look at everything in the worst light. It's not from philanthropy, it's from the heart. They, that is, Vronsky, had a trainer, an Englishman, first rate in his own line, but a drunkard. He's completely given up to drink. Delirium tremens, and the family were cast on the world. She saw them, helped them, got more and more interested in them, and now the whole family is on her hands. But not by way of patronage, you know, helping with money. She's herself preparing the boys in Russian for the high school, and she's taken the little girl to live with her. But you'll see for yourself."
The carriage drove into the courtyard, and Stepan Arkadyevitch rang loudly at the entrance where sledges were standing. And without asking the servant who opened the door whether the lady were at home, Stepan Arkadyevitch walked into the hall. Levin followed him, more and more doubtful whether he was doing right or wrong. Looking at himself in the glass, Levin noticed that he was red in the face, but he felt certain he was not drunk, and he followed Stepan Arkadyevitch up the carpeted stairs. At the top, Stepan Arkadyevitch inquired of the footman, who bowed to him as to an intimate friend, who was with Anna Arkadyevna, and received the answer that it was Mr. Volkev.
"Where are they?"
"In the study." Passing through the dining room, a room not very large, with dark panelled walls, Stepan Arkadyevitch and Levin walked over the soft carpet to the half-dark study, lighted up by a single lamp with a big, dark shade. Another lamp, with a reflector, was hanging on the wall, lighting up a big full-length portrait of a woman, which Levin could not help looking at.
It was the portrait of Anna, painted in Italy by Mihailov. While Stefan Arkadyevitch went behind the trelage, and the man's voice which had been speaking paused, Levin gazed at the portrait, which stood out from the frame in the brilliant light thrown on it, and he could not tear himself away from it. He positively forgot where he was, and not even hearing what was said, he could not take his eyes off the marvellous portrait. It was not a picture, but a living, charming woman, with black curling hair, with bare arms and shoulders, with a pensive smile on the lips, covered with soft down. Triumphantly and softly she looked at him with eyes that baffled him. She was not living only because she was more beautiful than a living woman can be. "I am delighted." He heard suddenly near him a voice, unmistakably addressing him, the voice of the very woman he had been admiring in the portrait. Anna had come from behind the trelage to meet him, and Levin saw in the dim light of the study the very woman of the portrait, in a dark blue shot gown, not in the same position, nor with the same expression, but with the same perfection of beauty which the artist had caught in the portrait. She was less dazzling in reality, but on the other hand there was something fresh and seductive in the living woman which was not in the portrait. Chapter 10. She had risen to meet him, not concealing her pleasure at seeing him, and in the quiet ease with which she held out her little vigorous hand, introduced him to Vorkiev, and indicated a red-haired, pretty little girl who was sitting at work, calling her her pupil, Levin recognized and liked the manners of a woman of the great world, always self-possessed and natural. "I am delighted, delighted," she repeated, and on her lips these simple words took for Levin's ears a special significance. "I have known you and liked you for a long while, both from your friendship with Stiva and for your wife's sake. I knew her for a very short time, but she left on me the impression of an exquisite flower, simply a flower. And to think she will soon be a mother." She spoke easily and without haste, looking now and then from Levin to her brother, and Levin felt that the impression he was making was good, and he felt immediately at home, simple and happy with her, as though he had known her from childhood. "Ivan Petrovitch and I settled in Alexei's study," she said, in answer to Stefan Arkadyevitch's question whether he might smoke, "just so as to be able to smoke," and glancing at Levin, instead of asking whether he would smoke, she pulled closer a tortoise-shell cigar-case and took a cigarette. "How are you feeling today?" her brother asked her. "Oh, nothing. Nerves, as usual." "Yes, isn't it extraordinarily fine?" said Stefan Arkadyevitch, noticing that Levin was scrutinizing the picture. "I've never seen a better portrait." "And extraordinarily like, isn't it?" said Vorkiev. Levin looked from the portrait to the original. A peculiar brilliance lighted up Anna's face when she felt his eyes on her. Levin flushed, and to cover his confusion would have asked whether she had seen Darya Alexandrovna lately. But at that moment Anna spoke. "We were just talking, Ivan Petrovitch and I, of Vachenkov's last pictures. Have you seen them?" "Yes, I have seen them," answered Levin. "But I beg your pardon, I interrupted you. You were saying?" Levin asked if she had seen Dolly lately. "She was here yesterday. She was very indignant with the high school people on Grisha's account. The Latin teacher, it seems, had been unfair to him." "Yes, I have seen his pictures. I didn't care for them very much." Levin went back to the subject she had started. Levin talked now not at all with that purely businesslike attitude to the subject with which he had been talking all the morning. Every word in his conversation with her had a special significance, and talking to her was pleasant. Still pleasanter it was to listen to her. Anna talked not merely naturally and cleverly, but cleverly and carelessly, attaching no value to her own ideas and giving great weight to the ideas of the person she was talking to. The conversation turned on the new movement in art, on the new illustrations of the Bible by a French artist. Vorkiev attacked the artist for a realism carried to the point of coarseness. Levin said that the French had carried conventionality farther than anyone, and that consequently they see a great merit in the return to realism. In the fact of not lying, they see poetry. Never had anything clever said by Levin given him so much pleasure as this remark. Anna's face lighted up at once, as at once she appreciated the thought. She laughed. "I laugh," she said, "as one laughs when one sees a very true portrait. What you said so perfectly hits off French art now, painting and literature too, indeed. Zola, Daudet. But perhaps it is always so, that men form their conceptions from fictitious, conventional types, and then, all the combinaisons made, they are tired of the fictitious figures and begin to invent more natural, true figures." "That's perfectly true," said Vorkiev. "So you've been at the club?" she said to her brother. Yes, this is a woman, Levin thought, forgetting himself and staring persistently at her lovely mobile face, which at that moment was all at once completely transformed. Levin did not hear what she was talking of as she leaned over to her brother, but he was struck by the change of her expression. Her face, so handsome a moment before in its repose, suddenly wore a look of strange curiosity, anger, and pride. But this lasted only an instant. She dropped her eyelids as though recollecting something. "Oh, well, but that's of no interest to anyone," she said, and she turned to the English girl. "Please order the tea in the drawing-room," she said in English. The girl got up and went out. "Well, how did she get through her examination?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Splendidly. She's a very gifted child and a sweet character." "It will end in your loving her more than your own." "There a man speaks. In love there's no more nor less. I love my daughter with one love and her with another." "I was just telling Anna Arkadyevna," said Vorkiev, "that if she were to put 100th part of the energy she devotes to this English girl to the public question of the education of Russian children, she would be doing a great and useful work." "Yes, but I can't help it. I couldn't do it. Count Alexei Kirillovitch urged me very much." As she uttered the words, Count Alexei Kirillovitch, she glanced with appealing timidity at Levin, and he unconsciously responded with a respectful and reassuring look. "He urged me to take up the school in the village. I visited it several times. The children were very nice, but I could not feel drawn to the work. You speak of energy. Energy rests upon love, and come as it will, there's no forcing it. I took to this child. I could not myself say why." And she glanced again at Levin, and her smile and her glance all told him that it was to him only she was addressing her words, valuing his good opinion, and at the same time sure beforehand that they understood each other. "I quite understand that," Levin answered. "It's impossible to give one's heart to a school or such institutions in general, and I believe that's just why philanthropic institutions always give such poor results." She was silent for a while. Then she smiled. Yes, she agreed. "I never could. Je n'ai pas le cœur assez large to love a whole asylum of horrid little girls. Cela ne m'a jamais réussi. There are so many women who have made themselves une position sociale in that way. And now, more than ever," she said with a mournful, confiding expression, ostensibly addressing her brother, but unmistakably intending her words only for Levin, "now when I have such need of some occupation, I cannot." And suddenly frowning, Levin saw that she was frowning at herself for talking about herself. She changed the subject. "I know about you," she said to Levin, "that you're not a public-spirited citizen, and I have defended you to the best of my ability." "How have you defended me?" "Oh, according to the attacks made on you. But won't you have some tea?" She rose and took up a book bound in morocco. "Give it to me, Anna Arkadyevna," said Vorkiev, indicating the book. "It's well worth taking up." "Oh, no, it's all so sketchy." "I told him about it," Stepan Arkadyevitch said to his sister, nodding at Levin. "You shouldn't have. My writing is something after the fashion of those little baskets and carving which Lisa Mertsilova used to sell me from the prisons. She had the direction of the prison department in that society," she turned to Levin. "They were miracles of patience, the work of those poor wretches." And Levin saw a new trait in this woman who attracted him so extraordinarily. Besides wit, grace, and beauty, she had truth. She had no wish to hide from him all the bitterness of her position. As she said that, she sighed, and her face, suddenly taking a hard expression, looked as if it were turned to stone. With that expression on her face, she was more beautiful than ever. But the expression was new. It was utterly unlike that expression, radiant with happiness and creating happiness, which had been caught by the painter in her portrait. Levin looked more than once at the portrait and at her figure, as, taking her brother's arm, she walked with him to the high doors, and he felt for her a tenderness and pity at which he wondered himself. She asked Levin and Vorkiev to go into the drawing-room while she stayed behind to say a few words to her brother. About her divorce, about Vronsky and what he's doing at the club, about me, wondered Levin. And he was so keenly interested by the question of what she was saying to Stepan Arkadyevitch that he scarcely heard what Vorkiev was telling him of the qualities of the story for children Anna Arkadyevna had written. At tea, the same pleasant sort of talk, full of interesting matter, continued. There was not a single instant when a subject for conversation was to seek. On the contrary, it was felt that one had hardly time to say what one had to say, and eagerly held back to hear what the others were saying. And all that was said, not only by her, but by Vorkiev and Stepan Arkadyevitch, all, so it seemed to Levin, gained particular significance from her appreciation and her criticism. While he followed this interesting conversation, Levin was all the time admiring her, her beauty, her intelligence, her culture, and at the same time her directness and genuine depth of feeling. He listened and talked, and all the while he was thinking of her inner life, trying to divine her feelings. And though he had judged her so severely hitherto, now by some strange chain of reasoning he was justifying her and was also sorry for her and afraid that Vronsky did not fully understand her. At 11 o'clock, when Stepan Arkadyevitch got up to go, Vorkiev had left earlier. It seemed to Levin that he had only just come. Regretfully, Levin too rose. "Goodbye," she said, holding his hand and glancing into his face with a winning look. "I am very glad que la glace est rompue." She dropped his hand and half closed her eyes. "Tell your wife that I love her as before, and that if she cannot pardon me my position, then my wish for her is that she may never pardon it. To pardon it, one must go through what I have gone through, and may God spare her that." "Certainly. Yes, I will tell her," Levin said, blushing. Chapter 11. What a marvelous, sweet, and unhappy woman, he was thinking as he stepped out into the frosty air with Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Well, didn't I tell you?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, seeing that Levin had been completely won over. "Yes, said Levin dreamily. "An extraordinary woman. It's not her cleverness, but she has such wonderful depth of feeling. I'm awfully sorry for her. Now, please God, everything will soon be settled." Well, don't be hard on people in future," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, opening the carriage door. "Goodbye, we don't go the same way." Still thinking of Anna, of everything, even the simplest phrase in their conversation with her, and recalling the most minute changes in her expression, entering more and more into her position, and feeling sympathy for her, Levin reached home. At home, Kuzma told Levin that Katerina Alexandrovna was quite well, and that her sisters had not long been gone, and he handed him 2 letters. Levin read them at once in the hall, that he might not overlook them later. One was from Sokolov, his bailiff. Sokolov wrote that the corn could not be sold, that it was fetching only 5.5 rubles, and that more than that could not be got for it. The other letter was from his sister. She scolded him for her business still being unsettled. "Well, we must sell it at 5.5 if we can't get more," Levin decided the first question, which had always before seemed such a weighty one, with extraordinary facility on the spot. "It's extraordinary how all one's time is taken up here," he thought, considering the second letter. He felt himself to blame for not having got done what his sister had asked him to do for her. "Today again I've not been to the court, but today I've certainly not had time." And resolving that he would not fail to do it next day, he went up to his wife. As he went in, Levin rapidly ran through mentally the day he had spent. All the events of the day were conversations he had heard and taken part in. All the conversations were upon subjects which, if he had been alone at home, he would never have taken up, but they were very interesting. And all these conversations were right enough, only in 2 places there was something not quite right. One was what he had said about the carp, and the other was something not quite the thing in the tender sympathy he was feeling for Anna. Levin found his wife low-spirited and dull. The dinner of the 3 sisters had gone off very well, but then they had waited and waited for him. All of them had felt dull. The sisters had departed, and she had been left alone. "Well, and what have you been doing?" she asked him, looking straight into his eyes, which shone with rather a suspicious brightness. But that she might not prevent his telling her everything, she concealed her close scrutiny of him, and with an approving smile listened to his account of how he had spent the evening. "Well, I'm very glad I met Vronsky. I feel quite at ease and natural with him. You understand, I shall try not to see him, but I'm glad that this awkwardness is all over," he said, and remembering, by way of trying not to see him, he had immediately gone to call on Anna, he blushed. "We talk about the peasants drinking. I don't know which drinks most, the peasantry or our own class. The peasants do on holidays, but Kitty took not the slightest interest in discussing the drinking habits of the peasants. She saw that he blushed, and she wanted to know why. "Well, and then where did you go?" "Stiva urged me awfully to go and see Anna Arkadyevna." And as he said this, Levin blushed even more, and his doubts as to whether he had done right in going to see Anna were settled once for all. He knew now that he ought not to have done so. Kitty's eyes opened in a curious way and gleamed at Anna's name, but controlling herself with an effort, she concealed her emotion and deceived him. "Oh," was all she said. "I'm sure you won't be angry at my going. Stiva begged me to, and Dolly wished it," Levin went on. "Oh, no," she said, but he saw in her eyes a constraint that boded him no good. "She's a very sweet, very, very unhappy, good woman," he said, telling her about Anna, her occupations, and what she had told him to say to her. "Yes, of course, she is very much to be pitied," said Kitty, when he had finished.
Whom was your letter from?" He told her, and believing in her calm tone, he went to change his coat. Coming back, he found Kitty in the same easy chair. When he went up to her, she glanced at him and broke into sobs. What is it?" he asked, knowing beforehand what. "You're in love with that hateful woman. She has bewitched you. I saw it in your eyes. Yes, yes! What can it all lead to? You were drinking at the club, drinking and gambling, and then you went to her of all people. No, we must go away. I shall go away tomorrow." It was a long while before Levin could soothe his wife. At last he succeeded in calming her, only by confessing that a feeling of pity, in conjunction with the wine he had drunk, had been too much for him, that he had succumbed to Anna's artful influence, and that he would avoid her. One thing he did with more sincerity confess to was that living so long in Moscow, a life of nothing but conversation, eating and drinking, he was degenerating. They talked till 3 o'clock in the morning. Only at 3 o'clock were they sufficiently reconciled to be able to go to sleep. Chapter 12. After taking leave of her guests, Anna did not sit down, but began walking up and down the room. She had unconsciously the whole evening done her utmost to arouse in Levin a feeling of love, as of late she had fallen into doing with all young men, and she knew she had attained her aim as far as was possible in one evening with a married and conscientious man. She liked him indeed, extremely, and in spite of the striking difference, from the masculine point of view, between Vronsky and Levin, as a woman she saw something they had in common, which had made Kitty able to love both. Yet as soon as he was out of the room, she ceased to think of him. One thought, and one only, pursued her in different forms and refused to be shaken off. If I have so much effect on others, on this man, who loves his home and his wife, why is he so cold to me? Not cold exactly. He loves me, I know that. But something new is drawing us apart now. Why wasn't he here all the evening? He told Stiva to say he could not leave Yashvin and must watch over his play. Is Yashvin a child? But supposing it's true, he never tells a lie. But there's something else in it if it's true. He is glad of an opportunity of showing me that he has other duties. I know that. I submit to that. But why prove that to me? He wants to show me that his love for me is not to interfere with his freedom. But I need no proofs. I need love. He ought to understand all the bitterness of this life for me here in Moscow. Is this life? I am not living, but waiting for an event which is continually put off and put off. No answer again. And Stiva says he cannot go to Alexey Alexandrovitch. And I can't write again. I can do nothing, can begin nothing, can alter nothing. I hold myself in. I wait, inventing amusements for myself. The English family, reading, writing. But it's all nothing but a sham. It's all the same as morphine. He ought to feel for me, she said, feeling tears of self-pity coming into her eyes. She heard Vronsky's abrupt ring and hurriedly dried her tears. Not only dried her tears, but sat down by a lamp and opened a book, affecting composure. She wanted to show him that she was displeased that he had not come home as he had promised. Displeased only, and not on any account to let him see her distress, and least of all her self-pity. She might pity herself, but he must not pity her. She did not want strife. She blamed him for wanting to quarrel, but unconsciously put herself into an attitude of antagonism. "Well, you've not been dull," he said, eagerly and good-humouredly going up to her. "What a terrible passion it is, gambling." "No, I've not been dull. I've learned long ago not to be dull."
Stiva has been here, and Levin. Yes, they meant to come and see you. Well, how did you like Levin? He said, sitting down beside her. Very much. They've not long been gone. What was Yashvin doing? He was winning 17,000. I got him away. He had really started home, but he went back again, and now he's losing. Then what did you stay for? She asked, suddenly lifting her eyes to him. The expression of her face was cold and ungracious. You told Stiva you were staying on to get Yashvin away, and you have left him there. The same expression of cold readiness for the conflict appeared on his face, too. In the first place, I did not ask him to give you any message, and secondly, I never tell lies. But what's the chief point? I wanted to stay, and I stayed, he said, frowning. Anna, what is it for? Why will you? He said after a moment's silence, bending over towards her, and he opened his hand, hoping she would lay hers in it. She was glad of this appeal for tenderness, but some strange force of evil would not let her give herself up to her feelings, as though the rules of warfare would not permit her to surrender. Of course you wanted to stay, and you stayed. You do everything you want to. But what do you tell me that for? With what object? She said, getting more and more excited. Does anyone contest your rights? But you want to be right, and you're welcome to be right. His hand closed, he turned away, and his face wore a still more obstinate expression. For you it's a matter of obstinacy, she said, watching him intently and suddenly finding the right word for that expression that irritated her. Simple obstinacy. For you it's a question of whether you keep the upper hand of me, while for me... Again she felt sorry for herself, and she almost burst into tears. If you knew what it is for me, when I feel as I do now that you are hostile, yes, hostile to me, if you knew what this means for me, if you knew how I feel on the brink of calamity at this instant, how afraid I am of myself, and she turned away, hiding her sobs. But what are you talking about? He said, horrified at her expression of despair, and again bending over her, he took her hand and kissed it. What is it for? Do I seek amusements outside our home? Don't I avoid the society of women? Well, yes, if that were all, she said. Come, tell me what I ought to do to give you peace of mind. I am ready to do anything to make you happy, he said, touched by her expression of despair. What wouldn't I do to save you from distress of any sort, as now, Anna, he said. It's nothing, nothing, she said. I don't know myself whether it's the solitary life, my nerves. Come, don't let us talk of it. What about the race? You haven't told me, she inquired, trying to conceal her triumph at the victory which had anyway been on her side. He asked for supper and began telling her about the races, but in his tone, in his eyes, which became more and more cold, she saw that he did not forgive her for her victory, that the feeling of obstinacy with which he had been struggling had asserted itself again in him. He was colder to her than before, as though he were regretting his surrender. And she, remembering the words that had given her the victory, how I feel on the brink of calamity, how afraid I am of myself, saw that this weapon was a dangerous one, and that it could not be used a second time. And she felt that beside the love that bound them together there had grown up between them some evil spirit of strife, which she could not exorcise from his, and still less from her own heart. Chapter 13. There are no conditions to which a man cannot become used, especially if he sees that all around him are living in the same way. Levin could not have believed 3 months before that he could have gone quietly to sleep in the condition in which he was that day, that leading an aimless, irrational life, living too beyond his means, after drinking to excess, he could not call what happened at the club anything else, forming inappropriately friendly relations with a man with whom his wife had once been in love, and a still more inappropriate call upon a woman who could only be called a lost woman, after being fascinated by that woman and causing his wife distress, he could still go quietly to sleep. But under the influence of fatigue, a sleepless night, and the wine he had drunk, his sleep was sound and untroubled. At 5 o'clock, the creak of a door opening waked him. He jumped up and looked round. Kitty was not in bed beside him, but there was a light moving behind the screen, and he heard her steps. "What is it? What is it?" he said, half asleep. "Kitty, what is it?" "Nothing," she said, coming from behind the screen with the candle in her hand. "I felt unwell," she said, smiling a particularly sweet and meaning smile. "Well, has it begun?" he said in terror. "We ought to send—" and hurriedly he reached after his clothes. "No, no," she said, smiling and holding his hand. "It's sure to be nothing. I was rather unwell, only a little. It's all over now." And getting into bed, she blew out the candle, lay down, and was still. Though he thought her stillness suspicious, as though she were holding her breath, and still more suspicious the expression of peculiar tenderness and excitement with which, as she came from behind the screen, she said, "Nothing," he was so sleepy that he fell asleep at once. Only later he remembered the stillness of her breathing, and understood all that must have been passing in her sweet, precious heart while she lay beside him, not stirring, in anticipation of the greatest event in a woman's life. At 7 o'clock he was waked by the touch of her hand on his shoulder and a gentle whisper. She seemed struggling between regret at waking him and the desire to talk to him. "Kostya, don't be frightened. It's all right, but I fancy we ought to send for Lizaveta Petrovna." The candle was lighted again. She was sitting up in bed, holding some knitting which she had been busy upon during the last few days. "Please don't be frightened. It's all right. I'm not a bit afraid," she said, seeing his scared face, and she pressed his hand to her bosom and then to her lips. He hurriedly jumped up, hardly awake, and kept his eyes fixed on her as he put on his dressing gown. Then he stopped, still looking at her. He had to go, but he could not tear himself from her eyes. He thought he loved her face, knew her expression, her eyes, but never had he seen it like this. How hateful and horrible he seemed to himself, thinking of the distress he had caused her yesterday. Her flushed face, fringed with soft curling hair under her nightcap, was radiant with joy and courage.